Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me for this CBD training. My name is Tracilea Young, and I'm a Green Compass advocate. I'm going to start this training by letting you know that I am not a doctor, and this presentation is in no way offering any sort of medical advice. A fun fact is that cannabis has been growing naturally for quite some time. As a matter of fact, land-raised cannabis was found in regions from Apollo to Afghanistan thousands of years ago. And land-raised means it was not cultivated. History tells us that cannabis dates all the way back to the Greek historians who used cannabis steam baths for wellness, and it was also noted in ancient India for a variety of ailments and illnesses, as well as for pain in childbirth. So to date, cannabis can be found, believe it or not, on every continent except Antarctica. So let's talk a little bit about the human body to learn the magnitude of what CBD can do for us. There are 11 major organ systems in the human body. Some you may be familiar with, others not so much, but they include the immune system, digestive, lymphatic, circulatory, muscular, skeletal, endocrine, nervous, renal, urinary, excretory, and respiratory. Each is very important, and if there's a dysfunction in any one of them, the result could be one or more conditions that would affect daily life in a negative way. Now, in 1940, CBD was discovered, but honestly, it was thought to be pharmaceutically inactive. And as we continued to use and benefit from it, we learned what an important role it can play in maintaining good health and proper functions of all our systems. Phytochemistry involves the chemistry makeup of plants, and as cannabis plants have been studied, they've found over 144 cannabinoids so far. THC and CBD are the most prevalent, and they're considered to be the main cannabinoids. Now, the entire plant can be used medicinally, and as studies continue, we find that there are parts of the plant with minimal benefits. Currently, our studies are focused on the molecules that come from the flower of the plant, which is believed to hold the highest medicinal quality and benefits. So as you began to investigate CBD, you may have heard reference to the endocannabinoid system. In 1988, the first cannabinoid receptor was discovered in the brain of a rat. Researchers found that the receptors reacted specifically to THC, and they were found primarily in regions of the brain responsible for mental and physiological processes, such as memory, high cognition, emotion, and motor coordination. 2 years later, in 1993, the second cannabinoid receptor was found as part of the immune and central nervous system. So it was then that researchers started to realize that they may be onto something. But the receptors were found in rodents. So they thought, what's the big deal, right? Well, fast forward to 1995 when researchers discovered that these receptors, now officially referred to as the CB1 receptors and the CB2 receptors, were found not only in rats, but within thousands of other species, including humans. So the endocannabinoid system is quite a mouthful. So moving forward in this presentation, I'm going to refer to that as the ECS. Now the ECS consists of special molecules. The receptors of the ECS, in simple terms, is homeostasis regulation, which is the body's pursuit of equilibrium so that all our systems function properly. So I love this quote. It kind of paints a clear picture of how a slight imbalance or deficiency can cause great upset. Dr. Bonnie Goldstein states, when your endocannabinoid system is not working properly, you have an imbalance, which can manifest as a medical condition. So read that again. That's very interesting to think about. Now imagine what our healthcare system would look like if people began using CBD when their medical conditions first appeared. Something interesting to know is that there are no pharmaceutical medications that directly address an endocannabinoid dysfunction, But the cannabis plant, which is a natural medicine, can help balance the entire ECS for a number of medical conditions. A natural land-raised plant has what our bodies need to address any ECS dysfunction. So let's look at what other important roles the ECS plays. The ECS is the primary homeostatic regulatory system of the body. Now, to give you an idea of how the ECS helps to maintain homeostasis, let me give you an example. So when we become stressed, our mind releases cortisol, which is the compound responsible for how we feel when we're stressed. Now, cortisol can be helpful when we need to react quickly to a dangerous situation. However, too much cortisol disrupts the natural balance of our body and our mind, and it can result in serious health problems. So when certain endocannabinoid aids are introduced to the body, it not only helps provide stress relief, but it helps manage our perception of stress so that we can look at the situation with a clear mind and make the best decision. It can be readily viewed as the body's internal adaptogenic system, constantly working to maintain a vast range of functions and equilibrium. Endocannabinoids broadly work as neuromodulators, there's a big word for you, and they regulate a wide scope of physiological processes, from fertility to pain. Some of the better known functions impacted by the ECS are memory, mood, inflammation, anxiety, pain modulation, sleep health, stress matrix, and digestion. Now, many people are asking, how does CBD work? Well, here's an example. In medicine, we speak in terms of active ingredients, or what makes medicine work in the body. And if we take something simple, let's take Tylenol, for example. The active ingredient, or the active medicinal ingredient, is acetaminophen. So it's the same with most medicines. They all have one active ingredient, one molecule. But with medical cannabis, it's very, very different. There are literally hundreds of molecules in the plant. And what's fascinating is that our bodies make molecules called endocannabinoids. And the only other major source of those cannabinoids is the cannabis plant. Now, to picture just how this interface works in the human body, you can imagine a lock and a key. Think of the cannabinoid molecules as little keys that travel through the bloodstream, and they fit into special receptors or locks on the surface of cells, and they affect the change and the functioning of all those cells, and therefore the entire systems and organs. So these oils, CBD oils, deliver cannabinoids and other cannabis plant extracts to our cells via the circulatory system. Now think back to the lock and key example. There are CB1 and CB2 receptors on certain cells that allow for the binding of cannabinoids. Once a cannabinoid binds to a cell, it works very much like a key fitting into a lock, and it will affect change in that cell and therefore create a change in the system that the cell is a part of. Now, throughout this training so far, I've referred to different types of cannabinoids, and you may have also heard these words in other places that you've been researching CBD. So I'm just going to go over them briefly. Endocannabinoids are produced inside the bodies of all mammals. Phytocannabinoids are found in plants, most notably the cannabis plant. Now, synthetic cannabinoids are lab manufactured, and they were actually developed for research purposes due to the inability legally to do research on the actual plants. A very common synthetic cannabinoid is known as marinol. Marinol is a synthetic form of THC that's been used in generic form, since the 1980s. It's very strong. It contains only one cannabinoid, and it does not work as effectively as the whole plant medication for many patients, actually. Although patients often find themselves stuck between marinol, which is covered by health insurance, and cannabis, which is not. Marinol does not contain CBD, which is really, truthfully, really relied on heavily. That cannabinoid is huge in the medical community. It also does not contain any flavonoids or terpenes. what we're talking about with what we want to do is we want whole plant medication, and that can finally put Marinol to bed, well, hopefully, if our voice gets loud enough. Now, in the meantime, there are many patients that are forced to rely on that drug, Marinol, instead of the real thing. Why is that? Well, I touched on it before. It's because Marinol is covered by insurance, where cannabis bud or any kind of medication that's cannabis-based is not. And that's tragic in my opinion. So why do you think Marinol is still being used? It's a really good question. I get asked this all the time. And the answers are truthfully very political. Marinol has always been used to slow down full plant reform. And that's because the stigma still surrounding cannabis culture. So it's also due to the lobbying power that's really, it's entrenched in pharmaceutical companies. So in general, the drug industry does not like cannabis. It sees cannabis as a threat. And we just need to educate people and train them on the plant. So a little bit earlier, we talked about the two main compounds of the plant, which is THC and CBD. And you may be wondering what the difference is. So THC, Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. That's a tough one. Let's say it 3 times fast. Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol is the key that unlocks the psychoactive part of the body, and that's where you might get the high feeling. The benefit is that it can alleviate nausea and vomiting, which is why it's a wonderful part of the plant for cancer patients. It can also offer some pain relief, and it can help mood regulation and can also be used as a sleep aid. So a full spectrum product will give you a trace amount of THC through Green Compass. And while a trace amount will not affect you in a psychoactive way, it can still be very beneficial medicinally. The CBD, or the cannabidiol, is non-psychoactive. It's not going to give you that high. It's a wonderful anti-inflammatory. It can alleviate pain, and it's been proven to reduce seizure activity. So now let's talk a little bit more about the psychoactive effect you get from THC, which really can be a concern for some. CBD simply does not create that same response of euphoria, abnormal thinking, the feeling of high, or any other of the unwanted side effects that THC-rich strains such as dizziness, raised heart rate, anxiety, loss of concentration. But going back to the lock and keys of the endocannabinoid system, which is the example I used earlier, the CBD key just does not fit into the THC receptor lock that creates that psychoactive response. So that being said, people may experience a gentle, upbeat mood or mental relaxation, but that comes in more of a clear-headed and focused manner with no changes in cognitive function. So the effects of CBD are felt more in terms of a physical reaction in the forms of pain reduction and muscle relaxation. And that's what makes CBD ideal for people who are wanting the benefits of the plant, but they're a little bit wary of the psychoactive response. It really is ultimately extremely safe. And I think that's why individuals of all ages are turning to CBD treatment. So as you continue to do your research, you may hear a reference to the entourage effect, which is defined as 2 or more medicinal compounds working together to create a therapeutic result. And that's where the beauty of a full spectrum product comes into play. Researchers are currently studying how compounds in cannabis interact to create this entourage effect. So in the next several years, the ongoing research should shed more light on the whole plant medicine, giving us increased insight into plants like cannabis and how they interact with the human body and how the plants can be harnessed for medicinal purposes. So who is CBD for? Well, CBD is really perfect for anyone who's exhausted the use of other treatment routes, for anyone who desires to improve the quality of life, anyone who's looking to be able to enjoy regular activities such as spending time with family and increased mobility and independence. It's also for anyone who has the desire to move away from traditional, invasive, and synthetic pharmaceutical drugs that have harmful side effects. So cannabis is considered safe, has a minimal interaction with pharmaceutical drugs, and has very little to no potential of overdose. It's very important to note that it's very difficult to answer how quickly CBD might work for each person, as each person is going to respond differently based on health and the density of their ECS receptors. You see, there are people who have higher density of receptors, which makes them very receptive and very sensitive when you introduce cannabinoids. Well, and likewise, there are many people with a lower density of receptors. We call those people cannabinoid deficient, and it will take them a little bit longer to respond to the introduction of CBD. So many people are asking about the benefits of using a tincture. Well, there's a list of reasons why I choose a tincture, and you'd have to find your own. But it's safe, it has long-lasting benefits, it can be standardized, which means every dose is going to be the same. There are no carcinogens, they're easy to use, they're stigma-free, and they're very discreet, which makes them very easy to use really anywhere. The ease of use and the fact that a tincture is discreet can be important for many who are trying to avoid that stigma that we talked about that often follows with cannabis. So it's also very convenient. As you take your drops, you just drop them in, your mouth in the morning, leave them under your tongue, and go about your day as usual. And then you add more drops in the evening. It's also very simple to administer. So pediatric as well as geriatric people are great candidates. Each batch is consistent, which is a huge part of the picture when being used for medicinal purposes, as many people rely on the same meds in order to get the same results every time to avoid that, roller coaster of imbalance. There's no device required, which helps people on a limited income. There's no inhalation required, which is ideal for those who have a compromised lung function. There's no risk of inhalation of carcinogens. So oils have a slightly longer onset of relief, but the effects can last 6 to 8 hours or more, which is a very viable option for long-term relief for symptoms during the day or even overnight. So how much CBD should you take, and how much CBD is safe? Well, cannabis is generally considered extremely safe to use, and it's especially the case with CBD. In fact, naturally occurring CBD is considered non-toxic, safe, and well tolerated in humans, and not associated with any negative health effects or abuse potential. So I like to encourage people to use the minimum effective dose. So in other words, you should start out with a very low strength CBD and work your way up from there until you find the smallest dose that works against whatever symptoms or whatever condition that you're trying to treat. It's always wise. I'm going to go back and say that again. It's always wise to start low and go slow. We call that the suggestion of start low and go slow. Let's make a rhyme of it. Oftentimes people get excited and they think, a couple of drops, that's not going to do anything for me, and they end up taking too much and they feel terrible. When you're brand new to CBD, start low and go slow. So let's start with an estimate for people. So somebody taking CBD for mental disorders such as depression or anxiety, they may want to start out with just 1 milligram of CBD, but somebody who's looking to treat pain might start with 5 milligrams. So for example, if you've got pain and you start with a 5 milligram dose in the morning and you don't notice any noticeable effects, I would suggest trying 8 to 10 milligrams in the evening and go from there. Let's see here, a dosing journal. This is really important in my opinion. We're all guilty of thinking that we'll remember an event, an amount, a time of day, but honestly, life happens, and the reality is we'll most likely forget. So a dosing journal will eliminate any confusion or inconsistency with keeping ourselves regulated. Things you may want to record in a journal would be the day and the time of your first dose, as well as the amount. You would want to record what time it was when you felt the first effects, and really important to note if you're feeling any side effects. And what that's going to allow you to do is find what we call the sweet spot. And when dealing with pain management, the sweet spot is very important in order to avoid the highs and the lows of pain management. Also, you may want to take your CBD doses an hour before a meal or an hour after a meal, especially if you're taking other medicines. And what that does is it allows the benefits of the CBD without interfering with the function of your liver while processing the other medicine properly. So oftentimes people ask if there's any side effects of CBD. Well, there can be side effects for a very small percentage of some people. The mild side effects may be from the CBD or quite possibly due to a hypersensitivity or an intolerance, not just to CBD, but to maybe some other compound of the plant. Very few reports of side effects have shown to be easily resolved by just discontinuing use. So some of those effects may be mild cases of nausea, dry mouth, drowsiness, a small drop in blood pressure, or lightheadedness, which is usually linked to the possible small drop in blood pressure. So research has found that you would need to take an incredibly large amount of CBD in a very short period of time in order to suffer any consequences. So I'd say it's extremely safe. So as mentioned earlier, there's been extremely minimal amounts of research done, even though many, many people use cannabis. The Farm Bill passed in January of this year. There are still tight federal restrictions that limit researchers' ability to study cannabis. All medications are typically studied so that we can find out if they interact with other drugs. And honestly, there just hasn't been that done on CBD. So the other thing that we are waiting on is for them to include the evaluation whether cannabis can be safely taken with other medications. And we're just sitting here waiting and wondering. But what we do know is that cannabidiol is a safe, non-intoxicating, and non-addictive cannabis compound that has significant therapeutic attributes. CBD drug interactions may be problematic in some cases, and I'll tell you why. CBD and other plant cannabinoids can potentially interact with many pharmaceuticals by inhibiting the activity of a family of liver enzymes. Now, this family of enzymes is called cytochrome P450. Now, this key enzyme group metabolizes most of the drugs that we consume, including more than 60% of over-the-counter medications. Now, at sufficient dosages, CBD will temporarily deactivate the cytochrome P450 enzymes, which alters how we metabolize certain compounds. So the way CBD interacts with the cytochrome P450 is important. So in essence, they deactivate each other. It's an easy way to say it. Preclinical research shows that CBD is metabolized by cytochrome P450 enzymes while functioning as a competitive inhibitor of the same liver enzymes. So I'm going to try and simplify this for ease of understanding. CBD displaces its chemical competitors, and it prevents the cytochrome P450 from metabolizing those other compounds. So it does this to the extent where cannabidiol behaves as the competitive inhibitor of the cytochrome P450. And it depends on how tightly the CBD binds to the active site of the metabolic enzyme before and after oxidation. So that change really greatly depends on how and how much CBD is administered, the unique attributes of the individual taking the medication, and whether the isolated CBD or it's a whole plant that's used. So there's a lot to it, a lot to really understand. But what we do know is that CBD can possibly slow down metabolization of cholesterol medications like Lipitor. That's important because some people have bad reaction to cholesterol medicines like pain in their muscles, and it could potentially make those reactions worse. I also think that for any drug that's potentially sedating and has some of the same effects as cannabis, cannabis could enhance those effects. So that's not necessarily a drug-to-drug interaction in the way physicians think of it, but it can enhance the central nervous system, depressing the effects of the other medications. So if a patient is on something like, I'd say, Valium, then personally I would suggest that they see their doctor to try and get them off the Valium before I recommend cannabis. So it's interesting to note that grapefruit juice interacts with drugs in the same way that CBD does, by inhibiting the cytochrome P450 enzymes. So the difference is that grapefruit juice is more commonly referenced on medication labels. Since both grapefruit juice and CBD can inhibit the metabolic process in a similar manner, it makes sense logically that any drug or medication that is advised not be consumed with grapefruit juice should also not be consumed with CBD. So the bottom line is, there really haven't been any rigorous studies out there to allow us to weigh in one way or the other on the cannabis and how it interacts with other products. But in my personal experience, CBD can help relieve pain. It can also relax muscles, reduce inflammation, and it does a lot of things that opioids don't do. Plus, it's safer. You cannot overdose on cannabis. So let's talk about CBD for our pets. As we discussed, when it comes to dosing CBD in humans, the situation is complicated. CBD is what's known as a biphasic compound, which means it has drastically different effects at low doses versus high doses. The bottom line is that more CBD is not always better. So in the case of a severe issue like seizures, high doses appear to be most effective. However, with something like anxiety, a low to medium dose will likely serve your pet much more effectively. So here's just a few general guidelines for giving your pet CBD oil. First, if your pet is on other medications, consult your veterinarian. That's number one. If everything is good, then start with 1 milligram of CBD per every 10 pounds of animal's body weight. And you can do this once or twice daily. Generally, it's good to start small and gradually increase. Now, that's the same concept that we have in humans. Start low and go slow. But you can gradually increase the amount of CBD every week until you see the desired benefits. So you see that the pet is actually responding. It's important to stay with your pet for several hours after giving them CBD to ensure that they're okay. Now, CBD itself is non-toxic, and so the most important thing to keep in mind is that overdosing on CBD will not result in fatalities. The most common reported side effects of CBD in animals are sedation and overactive appetites. So Fido's going to get a little chunky if we give him too much. So the one thing that we know for sure is that cannabis and pets, they don't mix well if they're not done properly. So while we don't have evidence that CBD interacts in a harmful way to our four-legged friends, the other main component of cannabis, which is the THC, is very dangerous to them. It's important to stick with our pet product to ensure safety. It's scary to look at the number of dogs admitted with poisoning from THC. That number has quadrupled since medical marijuana became illegal actually in Colorado. So the symptoms displayed by the animals would include vomiting, twitches, incontinence, difficult with mobility. Additionally, 2 dogs actually died after they ingested THC-containing food. So another study found that cats react violently when exposed to THC, and their behavior can be greatly worsened by a marijuana stroke. The main danger, as we currently know, lies in the risk of pets ingesting THC. So, bottom line is, let's be smart, stick with our CBD pet product, and help treat our pets safely. So I'd like to finish up discussing a common misconception that CBD comes from industrial hemp that's of poor quality. I'm going to clarify that right now. Cannabis, regardless of CBD or THC content, is derived from the flower of the genus Cannabis plant. Now, any genus that has less than 0.3% THC content is classified as industrial hemp. So to be clear, it's not that CBD cannabis plants are inferior or lower quality than THC-rich plants. It's easiest to view them as just having different chemical and medicinal properties. So here we are. I truly hope you've been able to glean some useful information from this presentation and that you have a better understanding as to the magnitude of help we can offer people with CBD. I want to thank you again so much for taking the time to join me. And truly, I wish you the ultimate in health and happiness.